Certainly their greater influence over human thought than any other individual. Now that's a pretty serious accolade. I mean, he was that important to the Western world, you know. And even Will Durant, no, here's Fuller's book on Bertrand Russell. Here's what he said about Plato.
Glasses?
I don't need that. Plato and Aristotle were the most influential of all philosophers. And he rates Plato above Aristotle.
Now who's that?
Bertrand Russell.
Oh, Bertrand Russell.
His book on the history of thought. So Plato is
one book also called The Message of Plato. I'm not able to recall the writer, but he went all the way to the Benares and met the TS member Bhagwan Das. There's some influence of Bhagwan Das in his work.
Over whose work?
This Message of Plato is a book.
The influence over whose work? I didn't
Bhagwan
know.
Das, you know him. Bhagwan Das, who wrote this Unity of All Religions,
Oh.
the Science of Social Organization.
well, we're all Platonists, whether we know it or not. If you're serious about all of this, the mysteries, we're all Platonists. Even though I don't never heard of Plato, we're all Platonists because we just think that way. Now, Plato, and his real name was not Plato, it was Aristocles. Aristocles. Plato was a nickname that was given to him because he was broad, and Platon means broad in Greek. So they called him the nickname Plato. But his real name was Aristocles. Now I mentioned that
Yeah. Have a seat. There's a little handout there.
come on in, make someone home.
My flip-flop.
Come on in, make someone home. We were just talking about Plato, how important he was, and the fact that, as I mentioned many times, all trinities are holy, sacred, whether it be trinity in science, psychology, philosophy, history, whatever. They're all sacred, like the trinity of time, past, present, future. There's nothing outside of that. That's all inclusive, includes everything. Well, they had a trinity back in these days of Plato. That trinity was made up of Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato. Those three. Now, Orpheus. Who was Orpheus? Mystery man. He's a mystery man. These don't know very little about him, but he had a great influence. His job was to bring the wisdom of the East, which was probably Tibetan Buddhism, bring the wisdom of the East to the West. Orpheus means dark skin, which means he's probably Hindu. From the same country that Jay is from. That was Orpheus. That's all that, there's not much to say about. All they is Orpheus and the Orphic mysteries. But aside from that, you never know much about him. When that happens, you know that they have a very mysterious and important occult purpose. When they say nothing about somebody that's had a great influence, but they don't know anything about him, he's kind of a mystery man. That's what Orpheus is. The term means dark-skinned. So he was probably from India. Probably. In fact, according to Blavatsky, or according to in the collected writings, that's what they say about him. That he brought the wisdom of the East to the West. And they did it through Plato and Pythagoras. Orpheus was the priest. Pythagoras was the scientist. Plato was the philosopher. That made the great trinity that made all of this worth knowing to the Western world. Now, the Western world has its own way. I'm going to quote William Quan Judge here. Theosophical man, in fact, one of the founders of Theosophical Society. And I've always enjoyed this. The West has its own work, the West has its own duty, its own life, and its own development. These it should perform, aspire to, and follow. I've always believed that. I've always believed it. We have our own way. Remember Emerson, we talked about him? He was wise enough not to use native Eastern terminology to New Englanders. They wouldn't know what he's talking about. But he put it in Western terminology. Plato did the same thing back in 400 BC. He did the same thing in the form of dialogues, of which he wrote 36. 27 have survived. But he wrote 36.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say Orpheus wrote the Eastern philosophies, but you specifically mentioned Tibetan Buddhism, what about Hindu?
What about Hindu?
What about Hindu religion?
Hindu religion?
We don't seem to have embraced many of their philosophies, mostly Buddhist. Why is that, I wonder?
Well, Jan, can you say that?
Yes, I would say whatever my understanding is, which is rather very limited, the major difference between the Hindu philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy is this. Say the Hindu philosophy goes by doctrine of karma, doctrine of reincarnation, and the liberation from the cycle of births and deaths. And fourthly, the authorities of the sacred books called the Vedas. So Buddhism does not accept the authority of the Vedas, but it accepts the first three principles. They do not deny Buddhism does not deny the validity of transcendental experience. That is what I would say.
Okay, it's just not the dogma.
Not the authority of Vedas. So in fact there are 9 systems of Indian philosophy. 6 are called orthodox, which accept the authority of Vedas, and 3 are maybe called heterodox, and Buddhism is one of those 3 philosophies.
Now let me quote a few. Thank you, Jack. St. Augustine, one of the big men in the church, said, Plato taught me what God was. Jesus Christ showed me the way. That was his statement. Plato that taught him what God was. Bertrand Russell, the most influential of all the philosophers, and Demills, who wrote the book, actually I have it there on Plato, he said the greatest influence on human thought that has ever been made was Plato. Plato was born 427 BC to an aristocratic family in Athens, Greece. At the age of 27, he met Socrates. And at that time, he was a poet. He burned all his poetry. He felt philosophy came first. And Socrates was the first just man he ever met. Reminds me of something they said about Gandhi. George Bernard Shaw said, the God has let loose an honest man, and the whole world's in hazard. That's what he said about Gandhi. God's let loose an honest man, we're all in trouble now. But when his family, Plato's family, arrested Socrates and ended up putting to death for creating the youth astray, he was so upset by that to see a man die for the sake of truth, he was so upset by that, his execution of drinking the hemlock, as you recall. I've got a picture of it right here. I had one. Anyway, I'll show it to you. There's a painting of this by Jacques David. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, I believe. It shows Socrates drinking the hemlock. But he was so upset with that Plato had to leave Athens. So he traveled. And that's when he got initiated into the mysteries, probably in Egypt. Because this has all come from India into Egypt, Egypt probably into Greece, probably that way. So he traveled in Asia, Egypt, probably went to India as well. It's hard to say. But at that time, he was initiated into the things that we're talking about here. And because it became well known, he was invited to come to Syracuse to reorganize their government, if he could. So he went there, and the head of the government was no longer the man qualified to be that, and he was called the tyrant of Syracuse. He was so upset with Plato, he had him arrested and sold into slavery. So Plato ended up a slave. Only great man in history ends up a slave. Somebody recognized him, bought him out of slavery and sent him back to Greece. That was an odd thing. When you get back to Greece, he felt his calling really was to found the academy, the famous Platonic Academy, which was the intellectual center of that whole area for 800 years, a long time, until it was closed by Justinian because it taught things that were not acceptable at that time. Plato called it rational mysticism. Plato was a mystic. He wasn't a mystic when he first was young, but he became a mystic when the intuitive impulse began to take over, so to speak. That's what we learned in the academy. The three things at that time, the Dark Ages came in. Three things brought on the Dark Ages. They say closing Plato's academy, the burning of the Alexandrian library, which was all the things were good at that time. That was destroyed in Alexandria, Egypt. And the other one was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, in which any Gnostic influences in the church were cast out and considered heretical. They say those three things brought on the Dark Ages.